Forever and Always. Written by Wondrous Wendy. Narrated by Ranger Zath. Chapter 2. No matter how long it takes, Darling's going to be here when his friend wakes up in medical. It's what Trench would do for him if their positions were reversed. While he waits, Darling stands at the room's counter, staring down at Alvarez's preliminary notes on Trench's condition. It's inconclusive whether or not Trench was exposed to the virus that spreads vampirism. Alvarez and her staff spent so much time triaging his wounds, they haven't had time to run proper tests. He knew Northmore would be angered by the results of his research into the sickness, but he didn't think it would send him into orbit. How reckless of him to assume otherwise. After all, Darling had condemned him to a terrible fate. Becoming a monster. No, that isn't right either. Northmore had to be a monster already to attack his junior research assistants. No one with a shred of humanity would commit the atrocities the Bureau witnessed today. A low groan draws Darling from his thoughts. He glances over his shoulder, ready and relieved to see Zachariah wake up at last. Thank God, you're finally... When Trench opens his eyes and turns his head toward Darling, something about the look in his piercing blue eyes makes the words die in Darling's throat. His blood runs cold. The hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Trench? Without acknowledging his name, Trench slides out of the hospital bed and advances on Darling, moving slowly. Still dressed in his torn dress shirt and slacks, he looks like he's survived the apocalypse. The bandage over his neck wound has started to seep with blood. Zach? Darling's brain orders his muscles to move, but nothing responds. This is what people mean when they say they're frozen in terror. A deer in the headlights. He can't break away from Trench's gaze, caught in a trance. When Trench reaches Darling, he takes up more space than usual, towering over him. Darling can barely breathe, his pupils blown wide. Trench moved carefully to avoid alarming him in the same way apex predators prowl toward prey. To avoid scaring them and causing them to run. If there was any doubt in his mind before, it has been incinerated with the stark truth on display. There's no need for tests. Northmore turned Trench, making him the new director against his will. Northmore performed the Rite of Blood. Trench raises a hand to Darling's neck to pin him in place. Darling swallows thickly, the knot in his throat catching against the firm palm. Pressed up against the counter, Darling's heart races like a rabbit in his chest. He should run. If he had any sense, he would struggle and shove Trench aside and bolt for the door. Instead, Darling remains transfixed, flushing from his neck down under the intense scrutiny. He realizes that the situation seems familiar. He's had this exact fantasy, being the focus of Trench's desire, caught between a solid body and a hard surface. Of course, Trench was in his right mind during that fantasy. And human. Trench leans close to his neck to breathe deep, and then exhales with a sigh. He catches a bead of sweat trailing down Darling's neck with the tip of his tongue, lapping it up. The sweet caress causes Darling's head to fall back against the wall, and he arches into the touch, desperate to feel more, moaning as Trench presses a knee between his thighs. It all happens so fast. One moment, Zachariah has him cornered with massive fangs poised to bite into his neck. The next, he's gone, having retreated to the opposite end of the room to lean against the hospital bed, turned away. Darling, you should... Trench grips the railing on the bed and causes it to bend. Go find Helen, now! Darling makes no move to flee, disoriented by the whiplash. So Trench growls and snaps around. The blaring fluorescent light in the room catches twin fangs and glowing red eyes. If he needed further confirmation that Northmore had stolen the life from Zachariah and transformed him into an otherworldly creature, the evidence now stands before him. Jesus Christ, Zachariah. Darling takes a tentative step toward him, but stops abruptly when Trench snarls at him. Listen to me for once, please! For fuck's sake, I'm dangerous! Freezing, Darling panics. He runs a hand over his face and debates with himself whether he should abide by Trench's demand or continue forward. He wants to help Zachariah so badly, but he has never heard him beg. I didn't know. I should have. He decides to leave, taking caution to not startle Zachariah, whose eyes follow his movements. I'll get Helen. When his shaking hand touches the door handle, Trench slinks away, hanging his head in shame. Lock me in here, he orders. Don't come back. So Darling leaves him in the room, locking it as he goes. As he walks away, he feels like a coward, for only a coward would abandon a friend in need. He would do anything for Zachariah. He should have ignored Trench's warnings and offered his neck to spare him from this burden. Helen isn't far, having remained in medical with a team of armed rangers in the event anyone turned. He finds her talking with Dr. Alvarez in the medical wing's lobby. With her gun slung across her back, she's prepared to fight if necessary. It's like everyone but him knew Trench had changed. Marshall? Darling calls to her with a weak voice. Trench needs to speak with you. She looks toward him and ends her conversation with a single glance. She moves past him in a hurry, heading straight to the private rooms. Darling finds an empty bench in Medical's lobby and sits down, exhausted. All the air in his lungs escapes in a wheeze. He presses a hand to his forehead, suddenly feeling dizzy. Was he really about to let Zachariah bite into him? What sort of person would willingly allow that? Darling stares off at a speck of dirt on the ground as he replays the scene in his mind. Trench stalked toward him with the intent to drink his blood, and Darling was turned on by the whole fucking ordeal like some kind of madman. It's one thing to covet a woman's husband. It's another to covet her vampire husband. Of all the people for Northmore to choose to be his successor, he chose Zachariah Trench. It doesn't feel random. Northmore threatened Darling in his laboratory and wreaked havoc. He had to have known Trench would come down to handle the situation as Deputy Chief of Security, but also as Darling's close friend. Northmore could have picked anyone. He could have picked Marshall to become the next director. She was in research with the Rangers and she was a threat all on her own. Instead, he picked Zachariah, fully aware of what it would do to Darling. In hindsight, Northmore's final words to Darling make sense. Perhaps with proper motivation, you'll work harder. The bastard knew exactly who to sink his fangs into. Northmore punished him for failing to find the cure he so desperately desired by attacking Trench. He knew Trench would survive the Rite of Blood as a fellow para-utilitarian, and he knew that Darling would have no choice but to continue his futile research to save the man he secretly loved. It all makes sickening sense. Darling covers his mouth with his hand and closes his eyes. He'll never forgive you. Fitting for his doubts to taunt him using Northmore's voice. After all, he has feared the man for years. His life is ruined, chained to the oldest house, to a hunger that will drive him mad. Do you think he will let his family see him like this? They will turn from him. But that's what you wanted deep down, isn't it? To have him all to yourself. A pity. You'll never have him now. Darling digs his fingers into his hair. He will never confess his feelings for Zachariah because he has no interest in stealing him away from his family. He would never impede upon his relationship with Kate. He would never ask Zachariah to abandon his beloved daughter in exchange for him. He's nothing. Marshall returns with a grave expression on her face. She joins Dr. Alvarez at the counter and talks to her in a low, hushed voice. Alvarez slips away, hurrying off. While Marshall waits, their eyes meet across the room. Her expression softens into a frown. Pity. More fucking pity. Alvarez returns with a small cooler, handing it to Marshall. It doesn't take a genius to guess what's inside. Sealed bags of blood. The Bureau's budget includes the purchase of copious amounts of blood for emergency transfusions. Northmore never took another thrall after Ash retired, so medical needed fresh supply on hand. This can't be Trench's fate. Darling's hand clenches into a fist. He refuses to let Northmore dictate the fate of the new director. There is always an alternative. Maybe if his hunger is managed, Zachariah's family won't be collateral damage in Northmore's revenge. With newfound drive, Darling races out of medical to return to the ruins of his laboratory to begin researching how to make synthetic blood. If he can just find a way, then Trench will have an alternate means by which to sate the hunger. Maybe he won't feel like a threat with it under his control. Maybe he won't lose the family he loves because of Darling's failures. This is Zath, signing off until the next chapter. I'll see you back here next time with Forever and Always, a Control fanfic by Wondrous Wendy.